Vayikra is referred to as Torah's Kohanim, the laws which pertain to Kohanim. So the Ramban writes, "Hasefer zehu Torah's Kohanim u'Leviim." It's the law which pertains to Kohanim and Leviim. Yevarbo inyonei hakorbanos kulon u'shmoris hamishkan. It explains, elucidates all the issues of korbanos sacrifices in total, and the watching, the responsibility to watch over the Mishkan. Gasher hoyo sefer echad binyan hagolos v'agulim imenu v'shlimu binyan ol moed v'kover Hashem shel mole miles hamishkan. He says the previous sefer spoke about the golus, the exile, the gula, and how we were redeemed from it, and was completed with the discussion of the Ol Moed, the communion tent, covered Hashem, and God's glory, Hashem Miles Mishkan, which filled the Mishkan, as we concluded the Sefer Shmos. Tzivo bekorbanos ubishmiras hamishkan. We're commanded regarding the laws of korbanos, sacrifices, and to watch over the Mishkan, how it has to be maintained in purity. Only the person who's qualified to enter is permitted to go there. The korbanos are an atonement for them, and that the sin should not be the cause of the removal of the Shekhinah. And the Torah commands the Kohanim that they have to sanctify themselves, like ritualizing their hands, their feet. They are permitted to enter into the Mikdash or partake of the sacrifices which are holy in a state of contamination. They're not permitted to enter areas which may be actually violating and desecrating the location. For instance, the Holy of Holies, only the Kohen Gadol is permitted to go. And in Kippur at certain times, even Aaron is not permitted to enter to the Holy of Holies when he chooses. We find at Sinai, when the Shekhinah was on the mountain, Hashem says to Moshe, will forewarn the people, they shouldn't approach the mountain, because if they approach it, they will be destroyed. We find the Mishkan was circumscribed with the crushing, with the vertical beams, as the Jews encircled the mountain. So we find that the Mishkan is really a replication of Sinai. Now, this is very important. The majority of the Sefer by Yikra discusses korbanos, Torah's HaKorban, Makrivim, V'mokshis Karabo, those who are qualified to officiate, to bring the sacrifices, and the location where you bring the sacrifice. The Mizbach HaOlah, the outer Mizbach, the copper altar. You brought all the meat korbanos, the birds, the meal offerings, and exactly how they were brought there. And you find other mitzvahs which have relevance to them. It starts with the korbanos which are voluntary korbanos. If you choose to bring an olah, a burnt offering, you choose to bring a shlomim, what exactly is it? How's it brought? How does one partake of it? And the Torah says that the chelev you sacrifice, the blood you sprinkle, but on a personal level, it's something which is not permitted. Then it speaks about, the Torah commands us to bring korbanos for chet, for sin offerings. We speak about the laws, the dietary laws, which species are permitted, what's not permitted. Because non-kosher food, non-kosher species, it contaminates the soul, contaminates. one who eats them or touches them. It says, if a person enters into the location which is holy, the state of Tumah, Yechayev Korban, Olav Yored, he has to bring a specific type of Korban. That we speak about the leper, person's a leper, the laws which pertain to a woman who gives birth, what's her state, the Korban she brings, and even after she goes to the mikveh, she has to wait a certain period of time. A male or female who has a flow from the body, the Korban, what Korban they have to bring when they finally they recover from this state, and when they're contaminated, what they're permitted, what they're not permitted. You should forewarn the Jewish people from the contaminated state. They should not die. Now Torah speaks about arayos, incestuous relationships, forbidden relationships. Ki mishkovo mitame. Because if you engage in that type of relationship, it contaminates. Va'avonim yikra tuma. Now this is important. The sin, that when you sin, person, God forbid, commits adultery or incest, it contaminates. We're not talking about contamination of coming in contact with the dead. We're talking about it contaminates the person, his neshama becomes contaminated. Goremes l'siv shchin l'godus. This type of behavior causes the Shekhinah should be removed from us. God departs from us and causes us to go into exile. V'od ki hashogig bohem. Even a person inadvertently engages in this type of relationship, b'chuyev chatos, he must bring a sin offering. Shizki kvar b'nefesh achas tefta b'shkogo. V'akach hizke mitzvahs hashabos u'modei Hashem b'avor ka'korban. We speak about the Shabbos, the korban that's brought on Shabbos. Modei Hashem, the specific korbanos that are brought on the modim, on the festivals. Shema Elu Modei Hashem, Lakrit Ishel Hashem. Berov Parshas HaSefer Yu Yedaber Ben Im HaKohanim. The majority of the portions in Vayikra speak about Kohanim. Daber El Aaron, the Bon Tzav Tzar Bono, Parshas Kedoshim, Sas Mitzvahs L'Yisrael, Ruban Nigroros, Iminyone HaKorbanos, U'Mohoma Forsh B'Shosua, Shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu. That's what Sefer Vayikra is. It all has to do with our relationship with Hashem through the Kohanim, through the Leviim, and we have to live within certain very specific areas, and we can't cross those lines. And if we cross those lines, it causes contamination. Contamination causes sibuk shechina, that the shechina should depart from us. And once that happens, the result of that is golus. If God watches over us, we're protected. If God forbid, removes himself from us, the consequence of that is golus, is exile. Okay? By Yikra Moshe, God calls to Moshe. If you notice, the Aleph of Vayikra is a small Aleph, and that's what's written in the Torah. And Hashem speaks to Moshe from the communal tent. What was in the Ol Moed? That's where the Aron was. That's where the Kaporos was. And the Shechina would speak from, as it said, Mibene Shnei Akruvim, from between the cherubs. Let's see Rashi. V'yikra Moshe, L'chol Dibros, L'chol Amiros, L'chol Tzivuyim, Kol Mekriya, before all the communications between Hashem and Moshe, it says he called him. He called him. Loshen Chibo. It's an expression of love. Loshen Shemalach Asheres Mishtamshim Bo. It's an expression. It's a manner which the angels themselves they utilize this. Shalem of the Korazel Zeh. We say by Kedusha Korazel Zevi Omar. They call to one another. When Hashem reveals himself to the nation, to the prophets of the nations of the world, it's an expression of like happenstance, Aroi, not on a permanent. Voloshin Tuma, in a state of contamination, Shinema Vayikor, Elokim El Bilom, Kerry is a nocturnal discharge. It's something Vayikor, it's something which is it's coincidental. It indicates when I call you, Vayikra, which is written, its full spelling, Vayikra, he called him. Calling, before I speak to a person, you call them. That's interesting. Gemara tells us in Nida that there's certain people Hashem cannot tolerate. And the last thing which Gemara discusses a man a man or woman enters into a home without knocking. To alert the person that you're coming into the house. Even a husband and a wife. Before you enter into a room, even if your wife's there, you should knock to alert her that you're entering. Why? Because she may be doing something of a very personal level, and by suddenly coming upon her, you'll embarrass her. So therefore, you should knock to alert her that you're about to enter. That shows that you value and you have consideration for that person's value by alerting them that you're coming. Someone who has no value, you don't consider. But regarding this, before you enter, if it's not your wife, definitely you should alert them. But even your wife, you should alert. The Sephora learns that Yisro, before he came to Moshe Rabbeinu, he sent a messenger. I'm coming, your father, I'm coming to meet you. Either you come out on my behalf, on behalf of your wife, on behalf of your children. What was this whole idea? He should have shown up at the door, at the doorstep. I'm here. So the Sephora over there says, he quotes this Gemara Nida, that before you come, you should alert a person that you're coming, that the person shouldn't feel embarrassed that you show suddenly he may not be prepared to receive you. So part of the protocol of consideration that before you come, you should inform the person you're coming. So that's why Yisro, before he went into the desert to become part of Jewish people, he alerted Moshe that he's coming. It was not for the sake of what, that he should give him honor. That was the first and foremost, that was the main point. Vayikra el Moshe. Because Moshe has that special value before Hashem communicates any commandment or any issue of importance, he first calls him to indicate, I'm about to tell you something. You should be ready, you should be prepared to receive what I'm about to tell you. Not that suddenly you come upon the person. Once told over a story, the Maral Diskin, Rabbi Shul Leib Diskin, is known as the Maral Diskin. His father, his name was Binyamin Diskin. There was a city in Poland which was called Lomja. It's always pronounced Lomja, city in Poland. And there was a yeshiva in Lomja. It was founded in the late 1800s, beginning of the 20th century. And Rabbi Shul Leib Diskin's father was the chief rabbi in Lomja. The Rav of Lomja. And the Maral Diskin, he had a level of genius himself that if he would look at a wall with as many bricks that were in the wall with one glance as a child, he was able to tell you how many bricks were in the wall. That was the broadness of his scope of what he was able to understand with one glance. So when he was 9 years old, he already was writing responsa regarding laws of divorce. I mean, he was something exceptional. Besides he was called the Seraphite. He was a very holy man. He was the rabbi in Brisk, the chief rabbi in Brisk before the Salvation came to Brisk. And this whole story, he had to flee from Russia, from Poland. It was under Russian control because he had done something regarding a certain Jew who converted to Christianity, who wouldn't give his wife a get. And there was an arrangement, and the Jew who actually converted felt that the Maral Diskin had misled him because he only gave the get to his wife, who was Jewish, because she could only remarry, even though he's a convert, he converted to Christianity, he's an apostate, And therefore he had to flee under the cover of darkness. His whole story with Marie Antoinette with him, that he fled through Paris, and he had met her, and whatever it was, and he gave her a blessing. Whole story. And he arrived in Yerushalayim in the 1860s, and immediately he was acknowledged as one of the leading Torah sages, the holiest people in Yerushalayim. It's Merel Diskin. So in the 19th century, the Russians actually occupied Poland. And the Merel Diskin is learned with his father's name was Benjamin Diskin. And suddenly, the house where he lived is surrounded with troops. And a soldier comes in, he says, "You must come with us immediately." Because he believed he was being arrested. He had no idea where he was going. No idea. They put him into whatever you want to call it, into this coach. He doesn't know where he's going. And all of a sudden he's taken to a very large amphitheater. And he sees the King of Poland sitting on the dais with all the cardinals and the bishops and everything else. And they escort him up to the dais. He's the chief rabbi of Lomzhin. And they tell him then that they just overthrew the rule of the Russians. They're no longer under their control. There was a revolution, and they succeeded. And now all the heads of all the religions are being summoned to speak about the greatness of the King of Poland. All these other people, the cardinals, the bishops, whoever, they were aware. They had time to prepare. The Merel Diskin had no time to prepare. And with the level of anti-Semitism that was in Poland, because it was a Catholic country, he understood that if he didn't say exactly what was sufficiently respectful, it could actually cause a pogrom. So he didn't know, but he wasn't informed. It was sudden. He's a Jew. Bring the Jew here, we'll hear what he has to say. All the others had preparation. They were alerted in advance, told in advance, we're going to have this event to acknowledge, to reinstate the King of Poland. The Merel Diskin's father was not aware. Because again, as a Jew, they didn't have that same status, the same value. L'havdil. The Yikra Hashem el Moshe. Full calling. Before Hashem spoke to Moshe, he communicated anything what first he called him. It's an expression of avo, of chibo, of love. That's what's Vayikra by Bilam is Vayikra. It was like happenstance, coincidentally. You meet a person on the street. You meet someone, say, I want to tell you something. I meant to tell you something. And you communicate that. That was Bilam. But what's the whole idea? We'll get to the small aleph. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest prophet ever lived. He's the father of all prophets. He was greater than those. It's the first of it's what the Ani Mamins regarding Nevuah. First, you have to believe that God communicates with man, which is Nevuah. Secondly, you must believe that Moshe is Abba Nevi'im. He's the father of all prophets, greater than those who preceded him, greater than those who followed him. That's Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah test, he prophesied in a wake state. Moshe Rabbeinu was the conduit through the Torah was given through him for the Jewish people to receive. And despite all this, he was a very humble man. He was the most humble man who ever walked the face of the earth. He was totally negated to Hashem. So Hashem says, I'm about to call you. Vayikra. So what does Vayikra say? Vayikra indicates Hashem is putting Moshe on a pedestal. He doesn't speak to Moshe like he speaks to any other prophet. It's fully fleshed out, fully alerting him in advance, which shows the greatest level of love for him because he's so special. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem, it doesn't fit well with my persona. That means you're acknowledging me. I prefer not to be acknowledged. So Hashem says, I can't say Vayikar. I can't introduce you as I communicate with Bilam. So if the aleph is large, what does that mean? That's a full acknowledgement. So Hashem says, okay, we'll make a compromise. We'll write it small to indicate that really you don't want to be fully acknowledged. Because if the aleph is large, that's a full acknowledgement. To write it without aleph, Hashem says that's not acceptable. So the compromise is, Moshe agreed, we'll write a small aleph to indicate the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the reason why the aleph is written small. Okay? That's the Midrash. There's a story. The Rebbe of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, when he was 10 years old, was knew the Gemara, the Talmud in its entirety. He was a child prodigy, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And there's a story of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He was learning when he was a boy. He was about 8 years old. He was learning with the chief rabbi of the city, and he wasn't that tall. So the rabbi sat behind this large desk, and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, as a child, as a boy, 7, 8 years old, stood on the chair, and that's the way he spoke to the chief rabbi. He was standing on the chair speaking to the rabbi. So one of the colleagues of the chief rabbi come into the office, and he sees him studying with a 7, 8 year old boy. The chief rabbi was one of the leading Torah sages of the generation. So his colleague says to me, he says, I see they must really pay you poorly, that you have to take on a tutoring job to compensate your income. Otherwise, why are you learning with an 8 year old boy? So the chief rabbi says to me, he says, this is not an 8 year old boy. This boy is qualified to be my chavrusa. He says, why don't you speak to him? You'll find out, you'll understand what he's about. Although he's standing on the chair. He's standing on the chair not because I'm tutoring him, but rather because we're having a conversation in Torah. He's on par with where I'm at. This is when he was 8 years old, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had a Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. He was one of the 36 hidden tzaddikim. And the way he would display himself, the way he would carry himself, ordinary clothing, ordinary attire, and he was a worker. He worked in a distillery. That's how he concealed who he was. So Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant was in Shul David Shachris, and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, as a 10-year-old boy, noticed, or 12-year-old boy, he's something special. So after davening, Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant walks towards the distillery, but nobody knows where he's going, what he's going to do there, and he follows him. He follows Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. Maybe he was 14 years old at the time. And Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant realizes somebody's trailing him. He turns around and he says, why are you following me? He says, because I want you to be my Rebbe. Yosef Salant says to Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant, so I should be a Rebbe. I'm a total ignoramus. What do I know? I work in this distillery. He says, you know, he says, you're a very special person. You're a hidden tzaddik. And I want you should mentor me. You should be my Rebbe. That's what he's talking about. He says, I'll prove it to you. When you davened, the way you put on tefillin, it was according to the position of Rambam. And you did this, it was according to the position of the Rabbeinu, of the Rosh. And you did this, meaning Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was so well versed in Shas, every nuance of movement of Yosef Salanter, he understood it was everything was exactly coinciding with the positions of all the Rishonim, with the Shulchan Aruch. The average person who looks at him doesn't even understand what's going on. But Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, because he was so learned, even at this young age, he recognized, and immediately, Rabbi Zundel of Salant couldn't deny it. And he took him under his wing, and he became his Rebbe. He mentored him to become Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. So Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant went to Yerushalayim, left Rabbi Shmuel Salant, the famous Rabbi Shmuel Salant, who was the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim in the old community until the age of 100, was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. Rabbi Shmuel Salant was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. He went to Yerushalayim, and also in the mid-1800s. And, you know, there wasn't much of an Ashkenazi community in the mid-1800s. Mostly whether were Sephardic Jews there for hundreds of years. The first Ashkenazi Jews were the ones where the Talmidei Agra, the Vilna Gaon students who went to emigrate to Eretz Yisrael in the early part of the 19th century. And the Vilna Gaon encouraged this because he believed that the Gula could only come if we start the immigration earlier, and that will precipitate the coming of Mashiach. That was the position of Vilna Gaon. They called Talmidei Agra. So, of course, Reb Zundel of Salant, he prayed at Netzmin. And they had people coming from Europe to observe the community, how special it was, and they would support the community. So a wealthy man comes to the Netzminion, and he sits, and everybody had the Mokum Kavur. You're supposed to pray in the place that you always pray. So this wealthy person who's used to being stroked and acknowledged and cuddled wasn't the most humble person in the world. Not knowing, he sits in Zundus Salant place. So Rabbi Yosef Zundus comes in the most gentle way. He says to the person, I ask of you, I don't mean in any way to offend you. You could sit in the seat right next to me, but this is my Makom Kavur. This is a place I normally pray here. Would you mind just moving over? When this man has this, where does this person have the chutzpah to tell me to move out of the seat? Nobody ever spoke to me this way. And openly, he berates Reb Yosef Zundel of Salant in the presence of all the people in the shul. Not that it was a big union. People were like aghast, they were taken aback. This person, he doesn't even know who he's embarrassing. He's screaming at this holy man, Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant. But the man feels he got it off his chest, put him in his place, he's okay. But the man didn't realize that he embarrassed himself. By embarrassing Rabbi Yosef Zundel, he embarrassed himself. So listen to the story. What if Rabbi Yosef Zundel of Salant did? Something Mark would have done such a thing. He felt that he was the cause of the embarrassment of this man. So after davening, he bangs on the bima and he says, I want to publicly ask Mechila, forgiveness from this man, because I caused this man embarrassment. You understand? He didn't realize who he embarrassed. When he finally found out who he embarrassed, then he was embarrassed. Because now he understood his baby was totally unacceptable, especially he picked the wrong person to embarrass. So here he's doing it out of humility, out of not valuing himself. He's asking forgiveness, but that asking displays tells you who he is. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I don't want to be written with a big olive, with a large olive. Because then it's obvious who I am. I don't want that level of acknowledgement. Don't write an olive at all. Hashem says that I can't do. I have to write it. So what's the compromise? A small olive. But what's that small olive say about Moshe Rabbeinu? It says he's the ultimate. That's called a barech min hakovid barech rodif achrav. When you flee honor pursues you. You can't escape it. The person who pursues honor flees from that person. The person who pursues honor pursues that person. So there's a famous word from the Kotzka. This person comes to the Kotzka and says, my whole life I've been fleeing from honor. And it says in Chazal that the person who flees from honor pursues him. So why doesn't honor pursue me? I've been fleeing from my whole life. So the Kotzka had a caustic mouth. He says to me, you know what your problem is? When you flee, you're always looking over your shoulder. Where is it? Where is it? Why isn't it coming after me? That's the reason why honor never pursued you. Baron Kotler, one says the Brisker Rov, the Chofetz Chaim, we study Mishnah Berurah. He knew that he was the leading Torah sage of his generation. There was nothing he didn't know. Anything he wrote, he authored. The Mishnah Berurah has been reprinted more than, outside of the Chumash and Siddur and Shas, no sefer has been more reprinted more than the Chofetz Chaim, the Chofetz Chaim Svarim. Mishnah Berurah, the Shmir Saloshin, all this. And his meticulousness, he left no stone unturned. He elucidates it, fully fleshes it out. He was a leading Torah sage, and his people in his generation knew who he was, the leading Torah sages. But yet, he goes down in history as what? As the Chassid, as this holy man. So Rabbi Kotler asked the Brisker Rov, why is the Chofetz Chaim world renowned as the leading Torah sage of the generation? He's known as the Chassid. It's the Chassid. Rabbi Chaim Grzinski of Vilna was known as the Rosh Kabag, Rosh Hashanah B'nei Agoli. There was nothing he didn't know. And the Rabbi Chaim Moshe understood who the Chofetz Chaim was. The Chazon Ish left Europe after the Chofetz Chaim passed away, because he held that as long as the Chofetz Chaim was alive, Europe had the status of Eretz Yisrael. Once he passed away, He emigrated to Teretz Yisrael. He left Europe. So why wasn't he known as the great Gadol Hador, leading Torah sage of the generation? That's the question he asked the Brisker Rav. So Brisker Rav answered, similar to what we're talking about now. He answered him, we have a principle based on Chazal, tzaddik goes by HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim. When a tzaddik decrees something, Hashem fulfills the wishes of the tzaddik. Even a person is not worthy of a bracha. If the tzaddik feels somebody should receive a bracha, the tzaddik gives that person a bracha, Hashem will actually fulfill the request of the tzaddik. It's the concept, tzaddik goes by HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim. The Chofetz Chaim knew everything. That's a reality. He knew. You know what you know? He asked Hashem, please, I should be acknowledged for my knowledge, for my Torah knowledge. I don't want no recognition. I don't want any payback for that. I want to remain anonymous. Okay, if that's the case, tzaddik goes back HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim. The tzaddik decrees, Hashem fulfills it. Therefore, Chofetz Chaim was not known as the leading Torah sage, although he was. What about as the leading tzaddik of the generation, the chassid generation? A person who's a tzaddik chassid, he always feels he's always lagging. He's way behind the 8 ball. He's not where he should be. See what he's going to pray to Hashem. I don't want to be acknowledged as a chassid. But if he's a true chassid, that means he's an onov. Onov means he doesn't believe he's where he should be. So that request he never made. So because he never made that request, that's the reason why he was acknowledged as the chassid, and he wasn't acknowledged as the leading Torah sage of the generation. That's what the Brisker Rav answered Rabbi Kotler, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. Same idea. Moshe Rabbeinu's Onav Mikol Adam. Please, I don't want to be acknowledged. If it's fully fleshed out with a large aleph, that means I am the ultimate. Hashem says, not to put an aleph that I can't, because people think like a bilam. You know, we'll make a compromise, a small aleph, but that small aleph tells you exactly who you are. The same thing with Chofetz Chaim, because since that tells it he didn't feel he was as great as he was at the level that he should have been. Here, Vayikra el Moshe, Hakol holich magid oznov. The voice of Hashem travels and reaches the ears of Moshe. But the Jews outside the communion tent hear nothing. Maybe for Hafsokas, for the pauses. Hashem communicates whatever he communicates, so he informs him he's about to communicate something. That's Kriya. What about for the pauses? After you hear something, you have to reflect on it to be able to fully comprehend what was just communicated. Maybe did Hashem say, now it's time to stop, to reflect on what I just communicated to you. Whenever it says Vayedaber, there was a kriya. It was predicated on he called him, but not for the pauses. What was the value of the afsokos, of the pauses? He gave Moshe time to reflect between one parsha and the other, and one subject matter to the other. Yeah. Could you understand? Moshe Rabbeinu learned the Torah in entirety in 40 days, and every day he learned the Torah in entirety. At the end of the day, he forgot the Torah that was taught him, and Hashem every day retaught it to him. Finally, on the 40th day, the 40th time that he taught him the Torah, he was able to retain it. So the level of information that Hashem was communicating to him, it's something it's not fathomable. So if Hashem is the teacher and you're the student, and Hashem is determining what capacity you have, what does he have to give you time to reflect with such a teacher and such a dimension of student? So we're saying, even though you're that special person and the teacher is the ultimate, you still have to pause to reflect, to fully grasp what it is. If the interaction Hashem and Moshe, you need time to reflect, to be able to appreciate what's being communicated to you. Definitely, a hedget who's lomid min a hedget, two common people, where the teacher is not the ultimate, And the student is not the ultimate. Definitely you have the time to reflect because you have a limited capacity. There's a word which I always use, you share something with a person who's bright. And what's immediately the response? I get it. But you realize when it comes to certain getting it is not enough. I get what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. But to appreciate, and the Rasul Sharm in his introduction to Rasul Sharm, he says, what I'm telling you now, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Everything you know. He's talking to a person who really knows. But you understand, but to be able to internalize what I'm telling you, we have to review and review and review because you have to reflect, to appreciate, and to somehow to be touched by the information that I'm communicating to you. Same thing. It's like, sometimes I give a share and I see a person's not paying attention. So I say to him, did you hear what I said? He says, yeah, I could repeat it verbatim. He can repeat what I said verbatim, but he doesn't understand what I said because he was distracted, his mind was elsewhere. The words he could repeat, but the import of those words, because he wasn't paying attention, he doesn't get the import of the words. So many things to be able to absorb and see all sides of the value of what just was communicated, you have to have that pause. If Moshe needed the pause, where Hashem was teaching him, so Hejid, Lehejid, two commoners, where the capacity is so limited, there's no question you need the pause to have an appreciation of what's being communicated to you. That's the concept. There's a story, I'm not sure from a Rosh Yeshiva, this person who was a great person, his colleague built a yeshiva, and he wanted his colleague, his friend, to visit his yeshiva to show him exactly how the boys learn. So, when you're studying yeshiva, there are many different things you study. You daven, you study Musar, you study in depth. And the fact is, each subject matter needs another different type of approach. You learn Musar, although you have to be analytical to a degree, but you're engaging in something which has to do with Yiras Shamayim. Fear of God, reverence of God, love of God, whatever it is. When you study Gemara, it's an analysis to be able to appreciate all the dialogues and the inner workings of what it's monetary or torts or contract, whatever it is. It's a whole different mindset, different approach. So this person comes, his friend, and he sees they daven with a level of kavanah one of a kind. Immediately afterwards, without a break, they start the morning Talmud session. And they're in it immediately. Without any hesitation, they go from one to the other. And at the end of that, they go into another subject matter, Musar. And then they're davening. So at the end of the day, the head of the yeshiva says to his friend, so what do you think? He said, there's something not right here. You go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. There's no pause. How do you go? When you study one thing, the mind, the emotion is at one level. One is totally cerebral. Then you have to somehow switch gears. You're going to something that has to touch your emotion. And you need a reflection to be able. How do you go? A human being is not a machine. You go from one step to the next step. You have to have a break to reflect before you before you go further. That's exactly the concept of the pause. As brilliant as you are, you have to have a level of pause to appreciate, to be able to internalize and reflect on what was just communicated to you. That's the concept. Mention his name. His name was Rav Meshulam Igra. Rav Meshulam Igra lived in the 1800s. He was the Rebbe of the Ktos HaChoshen. The Ktos HaChoshen was a leading Torah sage in the 19th century. Wrote a commentary on Choshen Mishpot, on Even Ezer, and the Sivs HaMishpot. Also, these were two Torah giants. Their Rebbe was Meshulam Igra. We have very little Navaleh recorded of Meshulam Igra, but his students The ones he meant to tell you who he was. Rav Shlomo Migra. Rav Shlomo Migra was a genius, one of a kind of a genius. And he lived in abject poverty. Abject poverty. And his wife was a special woman. She raised the children. And although there was almost no food, she was fully occupied with supporting the family. And she didn't want in any way that her husband should be involved because she didn't want to in any way distract from his Torah studies. So one day his wife says to him, I understand how immersed you are in your Torah studies, but at least you know what I'm going through. Show some empathy to acknowledge what I'm going through. Show me that, that you're my partner in worrying for the family. He says to his wife, he says, you know that I'm the leading Torah sage generation. I have a genius, one of a kind. What takes other people to figure out months, I can figure out in a moment. So he said jokingly to his wife, only a wife could take this. He says, what you worry in 3 months, I can worry in 30 seconds. That's what he said to his wife. So I am experiencing what it's not necessary. You understand? It's a different capacity. Empathy is something more than, it's not just intellectual. It's not cerebral. It's being able to see, he was saying, that's what he was saying, but he said it jokingly. What I'm touched in a way, even in a moment, what other people, till they finally get it, it takes months for them to be touched. Hashem called to Moshe, he spoke Elov to him. Lamayit Aaron. Elov comes to exclude Aaron, meaning the direct communication was only to Moshe, not to Aaron. Whenever it says, we'll see in a moment, to Moshe and Aaron, means communication was to Moshe to transmit it to Aaron, but it was never a direct transmission from Hashem to Aaron. Rabbi Yehuda Yud Gimel Dibros Nemru B'Torah Moshe Ul Aaron. 13 times it says in the Torah, Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron. Uchenegdon, listen to this. Nemru Yud Gimel Miyutin. And to correspond to those 13 times that it says V'Davar Hashem al Moshe Bel Aaron, the 13 times where it indicates to the exclusion of Aaron. Lamdoch. So what does that teach us? 13 verses 13. Lamdoch shel Aaron Nemru el Moshe sheyom al Aaron. It's not, it was directly, the communication was not to Aaron, but it was sent to Moshe to communicate to Aaron. Where do we find the 13 exclusions? To Moshe indicating the exclusion of Aaron. L'daber ito, medaber elov, ve'daber elov, v'noarti loch, kulat yistor skvarim. Okay? Yochel shavuk kol akriyo. Maybe the people heard the kriya, the calling. They may have not been privy to the communication, because Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who received the Torah. What about the calling? Talmud lo b'kol lo. Even the calling was only to him. Only he heard that. Kol elov. Moshe shama v'chol shamu. Only Moshe Rabbeinu heard the calling. But what? It's not only they didn't hear the communication, but even to be alerted that he's about to speak, they were not privy to that. But I always point this out. The 13 times it says in Torah, Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron. And to correspond to that, to indicate, it doesn't mean he communicated to both of them, because we have 13 locations which indicate to the exclusion of Aaron. So it means, when it says to Moshe and Aaron, means to Moshe to give it over to Aaron. What's 13? 13 is always Echad. The Echad is only to Moshe Rabbeinu, not to Klal Yisrael. Now why? We'll see in a moment. The audibility of the sound of the voice of Hashem in the Ol Moed, we'll see in the next Rashi, was no less than the audibility of the voice of Hashem at Sinai. So the question is, which we asked in the past, at Sinai, where he's speaking to millions of people, they all have to hear. So therefore, it's Kol Hashem B'Koach. It's that level of audibility that everybody can hear. You're addressing millions, but here he's speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu. Why does it have to be at that level of Kol Hashem B'Koach? Hashem, Kol Hashem B'Hodor, Kol Hashem Shover HaRozim. Why do we need that? The answer is that when anything Moshe Rabbeinu was the equivalent of Klal Yisrael. His neshama was the equivalent of the total Jewish people. The Torah is being given to the Jewish people. Just as Sinai, when it was given to Klal Yisrael, it was at that level of audibility because that indicates Klal Yisrael. When it's given to Moshe Rabbeinu on behalf of Klal Yisrael, he is Klal Yisrael. Therefore, the level of audibility of that kol is the same kol. That's the reason. Yud Gimel is Echad. The only one who is at the level who he would have the capacity to fully embrace Echad was only Moshe Rabbeinu. Because there was no trace of self. And because there was no trace of self, he was what? Kol Beis Yinemon. There was no one who was more dedicated to Hashem than Moshe Rabbeinu for that reason. There were no occlusions. Because there was no trace of himself, there's no blockage. Therefore, it's Echad. The only one to be able to receive it directly from the Echad, you yourself have to have that characteristic of Echad. Echad means there's no barriers. Therefore, it was to Moshe and not to Aaron. So when it says 13 times, only to Moshe, because only Moshe represents the Echad, no one else represents the Echad the way Moshe Rabbeinu represents the Echad. Okay, we're running late.
Rabbi,